folks.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Hi, Ray, John.
Hi.
Steve, Neil. I see also Andrew, I think a new participant. And I have no idea who on Duke is. Let's wait a few more minutes. I expect light participation given the summer vacation period. Thanks for the feedback, Andrew. Glad that you joined. Okay. John, are you also ready?
Yep, I'm ready. I'm just putting a skeleton of the minutes together in HedgeDoc right now.
Oh, good point. Good point.
To,
yeah, I will also take meeting minutes. We can always do that collectively, so we actually we capture as much as possible.
yeah, exactly. I'm just putting the agenda and stuff in so that we don't waste time on.
Yeah, and thanks for putting out the agenda ahead of time. We, as you all have seen on the mailing list, we had to cancel last week's meeting because we failed, or I failed to distribute the meeting invite with the agenda with enough in advance notice, and so we had to cancel that meeting and then give it another try. But now John has set up a recurring meeting. In case you have seen that from the IETF meeting website, from the working group meeting website, and so I think that should be a non-issue in the future, but you never know. But at the end of the meeting, we are going to spend the last 5 minutes to just talk about like maybe 2 items that we want to put in the agenda for next week, so we are safe on that side. Okay. John, do you want to say a few words about the agenda and maybe do a little bit of batching? Maybe some of the folks here on the call. Hi, Ori. Hi, Hank. Hi, Casey.
yeah, definitely. Definitely want to do a call for agenda bashing and also bash the agenda bashing myself. So I've got an item. Does anybody else have items outside of the published agenda that they want to tackle?
Yeah, actually, I have maybe a discussion for about 5-10 minutes about how to mold what we saw from anyway. So yeah, what we saw from Dick and what I see above what the structure that we have now and sort of that data item. Thanks.
What would be the name of that agenda item?
I'll think about it and put it in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So sounds like that's the only one. So mine, I will put a message out on the mailing list as well to make all of this very fair, but just it's already time to start thinking about 118 in Prague. The session request tool is open. So if anyone has any strong requirements or opinions on the session for 118, if it should be at the beginning of the week or the end of the week, or wants to express clash avoidances, if we collect those early, it'll be easier to accommodate, obviously. Henk?
Yeah, hi, this is Hank. Just coming back to an item that I heard earlier before, which is that SCITT is now a recurring interim. At least the data tracker tells me that's not true. Just highlighting. So I'm synchronizing the data tracker into my schedule, but maybe something was async, so I synced it. Nothing showed, and I looked at the site itself, and nothing shows. Just as a cross check.
Let me double check that. I clicked buttons to make it recurring, but maybe that didn't happen. Or maybe they need to be approved separately. Who knows? I'll make a note to double check that's actually happening.
That may happen, yeah. John, should we reorder the agenda items a little bit? Because, for example, the progress reports are probably shorter than the review of the PRs and the issues.
Fine,
or also regarding the feed structure, talk a little bit about where we are with the feed structure, kind of progress on that.
Yeah, I figured that one should go last because it's that's the likely to be the never-ending chat item.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, we can do the other three.
Yeah.
In whatever order we see fit. So Ori's here. I'm here, and Henk is here. So we can certainly do Scrappy. Do Ori or Henk any particular feedback or updates or comments for the group on Scrappy so far? Henk?
Yeah, so I added myself as a reviewer and was then blocking or locking on Ori's comment on your question, what's the payoff for having a YAML version? Oh, yeah. I can reflect a little bit of the CBOR working group's opinion here, I hope. Carsten will correct me if I was wrong later. That YAML is actually a good alternative or optional diagnostic language for CBOR. So so I'm not entirely sure if we want to send it over the wire, because line breaks. So I once, before CBOR, I once did a base 64 encoded line of YAML to put another base 64 encoded message that is all these lines of YAML, because it's line break oriented, and it was a nightmare. And just because it had to go through some binary in the end. And so yeah, I think all of us have been there at some point using YAML. I'm not against that as a because this is a media type comment. As really putting that on the wire, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a representation problem, not a transport problem or a encoding problem, but that's maybe just me. But I know that the CBOR working group is basically fond of, but never really came to using YAML as a diagnostic representation for CBOR, for example.
What would be the benefit of using YAML? Like it's for the API, right? We are talking about the API, are we?
Yes, indeed. So this is for the API, and the API will have control messages, protocol messages, of course. And yeah, I think this to-do is coming from Ori. He also gave a comment, but Ori is also here. Maybe he can reply to that if he is listening and not distracted. There you
Yes. I'll just jump ahead. So with COSI and CBOR, you often have binary formats that you're moving around, and a lot of developers will parse the binary formats correctly, perfectly, with no armoring or encoding in a human readable or text safe representation. That's the ideal case. In my experience, most of the time they will misparse the binaries or at some point be making some kind of binary parsing mistakes. And at that point, they may fall back to encoding the binaries as text to move them across API boundaries. I think that encoding as text thing is maybe not always a great thing that happens in APIs, but at the same time, a lot of API tooling is not really ready for CBOR or COSI. And so you might want to, when you're building an API, plan ahead for the fact that, for example, Open API specification might not handle COSI or CBOR content types as nicely as it will handle string encodings. And so what you can do is you can say, here's the content type for COSI or CBOR, and here's a JSON or YAML representation of the same kind of response types. And the YAML and JSON versions can be really, really helpful to implementers. It's again, like, it's going to make payloads more expensive. It makes the API interface potentially more complicated. You could have cases where maybe you're negotiating for content types on the API, and then there's different API considerations. If the API isn't over HTTP, how are you handling your different content types, et cetera? With all that being said, my experience working with COSI structures that we have today with APIs is that I just prefer to wrap them in YAML or JSON before I do anything with them. I just find it easier as a developer to work with API representations that are like that. Maybe that's just the test or development mode thing that goes away when you get to the production case. But I think I would be concerned about how much adoption you might get if you stick to an API that's pure CBOR and COSI. It's difficult for developers to work in that space sometimes. That's it.
So it's I will have to check. It would essentially be a way to define this. So would an issuer potentially use like a JSON representation of the sign statement, or would that still be a binary representation as today, and then kind of behind the scenes on the API, it would be the binary version would be translated or transcoded into sort of JSON style?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I think the main experience that I've had so far is when I build the Open API specification documents to describe the SCITT APIs, if the response type is CBOR, then I need to handle pure binary formats across the wire consistently. And, you know, maybe it's just that I'm tortured by living in the web platform, but web platform binary support is not that great. And so you end up having to do, you know, you end up feeling the different binary representations right at the API boundary in a way that is not as comfortable as having a kind of armored serialization for binary. That's it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, I see Ray in the queue. Ray?
Yeah, let me just say I completely agree with that. And the reason is because, you know, we're human beings and ultimately we have to work with this stuff. And the closer we can get to making it always something that we can understand, the easier it is to debug it. Time and again, I've seen things that were very much, you know, binary encodings, but eventually you have to be able to follow that. You have to be able to decode it and put it into a format where you can say, okay, this is what we're working with, so that you can check it all the way through. Indeed, you know, once maybe everything is locked down, that can go away, but likely, you know, unless we see a real need for it, I don't know. I know that, you know, ASN.1 was the sort of precursor for packing things into a really tight binary format. And that's sort of what CBOR replaces. But that came from a time when computer memory and bandwidth was really in short supply. Today, we don't have any short supply. Well, we have, everything is limited, but not to the extent that it used to be. And so if we could leave it in JSON, I'm not a fan of YAML. So I'll just be honest with you. It's the syntax is not as clear cut. So I would promote JSON. It's obviously the absolute leader in terms of interface, you know, syntax. And why not just leave it in that? It's a good question to ask. Why go to CBOR? Is there a reason? And if there's not a reason, you know, you could leave it, the structure or whatever it is that right now we're re-encoding into a CBOR and then encrypting that. You could just leave that in this as a JSON block and do the same thing with it, as long as the JSON had limit, you know, special. And indeed, there are some fields that are going to have to be, if you put that into an encoding that is, you know, human readable, some parts that are not going to be, right? So the binary, you know, say signature is something that's still very opaque. I don't know, you know, you can't read it. So that it can be encoded in something that is still transportable. But this is a question, is there, I just think that, yeah, I'm going along with what Ori is saying, in that the APIs should not, the thing that are obviously going to be used by human beings, which is the APIs to do this, should not be, maybe there's a way we can have the JSON encode, a standardized JSON for everything. That is what we mainly target, and then if necessary, it's turned into COSI and CBOR. But you know, I'm not going to be pushing that point of view. I'm just saying I agree with the idea that it should be human readable. And I'll shut up at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. John.
Yeah, just a quick note. Thanks for the previous comment. So I get it now, and I've not resolved, because we don't have that turned on, but yeah, resolved my comment on the PR and approved it. I think that's fine. I think I got hung up in a similar way to Ray, of just wondering why we don't just stick with JSON. But yeah, everything else about portability across the boundaries and readability and debuggability, makes a ton of sense. I've had to do that in working with the emulator and implementing this thing already. So I think all of that makes a lot of sense. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Henk.
Yeah, so one reason to stick with one thing, at least for the authenticity and the tree part, of course, is the homogeneity, the uniform method applied for signature checking, so for authenticity checking. That makes a lot of sense. That's why we decouple the statement media types from the surrounding authenticity representation, which at the moment is cozy. And there's good reason for that. So we have already the liberty to render the statements as ever we want. And we can also do the API calls as however we want. We can write proprietary protocols to perform the exact same actions as the reference API, and then you create valid, I want to say verifiable data structures now. Sorry, not only trees, and then work on them. But in order to provide the interoperability between all the trees, sorry again, verifiable data structures, you need this one authenticity representation. And the most useful common denominator, we think, is cozy, because we can't be stuck in a representation problem now. We will make a decision for some time into the future here, and going with JSON, which is, and I absolutely feel you, Ori, a little bit web platform problem. Yes, the support might not be great, but again, we could also improve on the tooling for the web platform representation to debug things. Like, for example, I heard YAML from Ray, I think, not so great. JSON, nice. Seaboard Diag literally is JSON with the few things that JSON never ever cannot express, so it has to be tinkered with a little bit to make it represent Seaboard. So Seaboard diagnostic representation basically is JSON++ for humans to read it, the Seaboard. So maybe that's already good enough. Maybe that is not highlighted enough. Maybe that is not known well. That is a Seaboard WG problem, and it should be fixed. Having said that, I think that the real challenge here is when you start to include Jose as the authenticity envelope, you will splinter the validation procedures and interoperable verifiable data structures, and that is a problem, I assume. You can work around that, I think, with more complexity, but then again, other and more severe mistakes can be made.
Thank you, Henk. Neil.
Yeah, I think I agree mostly with Henk. I'm concerned. I mean, just having seen all the problems for decades that have happened in the world of canonicalization, the notion of having kind of two different ways to represent something seems fraught with problems. I mean, I have to say I haven't looked at the API, so I'm not really sure what's going on. But and I'd love some specific examples. But it seems that sticking to something, and I don't know what it should be, is better than having one way that the data shows up when you're signing it and a different way that it shows up when you're passing it around.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Yeah, I can obviously understand sort of the desire to use also something like a JSON-based version, giving the way how various languages support JSON-based structures. Like you can find, as a developer, you can find hundreds of tutorials for different languages like Go or whatever, on how easy it is to parse all that data structure. So I can certainly understand. What I would like to avoid is having two different encodings because we can't decide. So having both worlds, I think that makes it even worse. So we would have to decide fairly soon. I think functionality-wise, we could do all the things we want and the functionality we need in Jose and in Cose. So that shouldn't be an issue. And at least that's my understanding. But yeah, would be good to decide that sooner rather than later. Ori.
So we should be careful. There's a difference between, a media type or concrete representation of a spec concept like a receipt and a representation of a response from the API. The response from the API can just be the same as the spec representation, or it can be a different media type that wraps the spec representation. It can do that and stay in CBOR, or it can do that and cross a media type boundary. So you have a CBOR object that's exposed as JSON as a JSON structure, for example. So the kind of question that I have would kind of come back to what's the purpose of the API? If the purpose of the API is just to maximize the adoption potential, the API could just be, essentially only there to increase implementer experience and the number of implementations. It could be there to make it really easy to test the data structures that are required by the protocol. And in that case, like, the API isn't really meant to be consumed in a production environment with its representation sort of acknowledged as, normatively in specifications. That kind of API is just there to help with adoption. On the other hand, it could be an API that, you're expected to implement this API exactly as it's stated, and then you really would not want to expose anything other than the highest performing representations possible. And so I would say if the SCITT API's purpose is to actually be implemented outside of a testing environment and a production, high volume, critical security, critical infrastructure environment, then I would say YAML and JSON are completely off the table, and you have to do everything in CBOR, and you've got to get your CBOR perfect. And you probably want to register media types and go into some extra details to make sure that that production grade SCITT API is really doing a great job for a pure binary format, because as you know, APIs for pure binary formats are not always exposed super nicely. So there would be a lot of potential work you might want to do to make that really comfortable. On the other hand, if the purpose of the API is really just to help get you a receipt, and you really want it to be very readable, and it's okay for it to be space inefficient, and the expectation is everyone's going to go implement some higher performing, potentially proprietary or different API after they kind of use this scrappy API to figure out how to implement SCITT. It's a different set of considerations. So I'm not sure exactly what the mission objective is for the scrappy API. I think we would need better clarity around that to give better design recommendations around it.
Yeah. So my expectation for the API was that this would be a mandatory to implement API for the production environment. This is not there's a test application and so on. So it's like for interoperability between the issuer and the transparency service, you need to have some form of API. And I don't think per se, if you JSON would be off the plate, as you said, for such a production level implementation that needs to scale. Because if you look at how web services work today, they also production quality, and they use JSON. So I like all the beautiful web services we use more or less use JSON. So I wouldn't dismiss it as such. But Hank.
Yeah, I have to amend my comment, obviously. Yeah, I was talking about the authenticity layer. I think what I heard is Ori said, yeah, don't touch that. It's about the protocol. So API here means protocol message representation, and you can do whatever you want. I think that is absolutely fine. I'm not entirely confident that a CBOR API is mandatory to implement, but it's very strongly recommended to be global interoperable in the end, and therefore it might make sense to have that always in your back pocket somehow. But I see no harm in using HTTP 1.1 as the transport protocol, implementing something in JSON protocol messages that then include base 64 URL safe, I don't know, represented CBOR to send that around and to get that one validated receipt with the standard library. So sorry, my doorbell is ringing. But this is my reply. So yeah, on the protocol level, which I think we have to somehow check maybe here in this group, do we mean with API protocol? And on that level, to the thing that moves the messages around, you can definitely use JSON, I think, as an addition to the origin that is CBOR.
So Ori, you were asking what are you talking about the payloads, like for example the sign statement versus the protocol. The protocol doesn't have a lot of CBOR to begin with, or CBOR or JSON or whatever. Like a RESTful API doesn't have a lot of, like, it's not like SOAP where you encapsulate lots of messages. Like maybe when like the existing API description, like it has maybe a structure for a response. If there's an error response, it has a type and like a human readable text or so. So there, I think, like the question about like how should I encode that response is probably less of an issue. But maybe I'm seeing that wrong. Ray.
Okay, so like if you look at the major, API situation today, like if you look at AWS and all of their services, they're all JSON interface, and you submit. They have a very simple submission mechanism, and you submit some sort of JSON chunk, and you get one back, and it may be pretty extensive, and so that's. And the idea that if something is a little bit more capable than JSON, I would say just whatever that capability is can be simplified and made into JSON, because that's the going thing. But I wanted to paint a little similar picture to what they did with QR codes in Europe for the COVID document card, or guess you carry around. So of course a QR code is something a human can't read, but a computer can. And you honestly don't care what the conversions are until you get up to the point when you can read it. So eventually you've got to be able to read this thing. And so what they did was they took a simplified JSON structure with very simple, keywords, 2 letters or 3 letters, and then whatever the value is for each one, and that gets wrapped up in CBOR. I think they use base 45 encoding or something, and eventually it gets turned into a QR code. So honestly, at that low level, nobody really cares how this thing is converted from the QR code encoding, which is way different, and then read Solomon, whatever, and then you go through the base 40, you undo that, you go through base 45, you go through CBOR, eventually you get back to this human readable form, so that somebody can not necessarily human read it, but you're going to have some piece of software that somebody has to write, and they have to take these fields and remember what the hell they mean, and do something with it. The same is true here, where we're going to have people who are going to be looking at the fields eventually in their software after they get through all the API and you need to do something with it. And at that level, it needs to be unwrapped from all of whatever encoding is required. I'm not saying that we need to change from, even think about changing from the structure of COSI and CBOR. Those are cool. But once you get up past that, and especially the API of what you submit to this thing, and you get a thing back, that should all be just plain Jane JSON. And I'm not talking about a horrible amount of overhead here. The JSON chunks are usually, just in the number of hundreds of bytes or maybe 1,000 bytes or something. And they can be trimmed down for IoT. So it's not. Now, on the other hand, I see the need for, if we're talking a Merkle tree and what goes in it, I'm not debating anything there. That should be, very much a minimalistic kind of thing, because the thing grows without bound. And so you don't want to have something that's in there that's very big. But I thought I'd paint that picture to say that the definitely the API needs to be, in my view, I would fight for, JSON as a way to do it. The stuff that you pass in and out, you may have, encoded, but it's binary, but it's encoded so that it's something that can be easily gobbled up by, an API interface. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ray. Hank.
Yeah, just really quick. I'm absolutely with Ray here. The European Union Digital COVID Certificate is a COSI CBOR structure that is base 45 encoded in a QR code, a 2D code, and that's it. And it shows even text labels that are true string characters because they are small enough to be human readable, so to speak. So you do not see a 0 and a 1 there. You see 2 letters that make sense to you, like first name, last name, FN, LN, and such, and to make sense in a diagnostic notation. And then they have that's a representation thing. And then when you show it to some scanner and it scans the QR code, it decodes it for the human to be readable. And that's exactly what's happening here. And I think on the payload side, we are safe. On the authenticity level, I think we established COSI is fine. And I also think on the reference API, we can have at the minimum a CBOR one, and we can have other ones and show how they would be implemented as reference. I think there's no harm in that. As long as we understand that the core structures that are defined by architecture and COSI IDs are all uniform.
Thank you, Hank. Ori.
So, I mean, just for the sake of making stronger statements that are potentially more triggering, I would say there should be a mandatory to implement CBOR API. And if you implement this specification for the SCITT API, you should expect mandatory support for CBOR. And that should be all you need. You shouldn't need anything else. If in support of that mission, we add optional YAML encodings for readability and CBOR diagnostic, et cetera, I think that is nice to have implementation detail that, if someone's excited to do that work, let them do it. But it should be completely unnecessary to ever ask for YAML or JSON from the SCITT API. And I think implementers should not expect any interoperability around YAML or JSON from the SCITT API. So I'll make that strong statement, and maybe it will sort of help us move beyond the sort of place that we're at right now. Like, again, the data structures returned from the API are not always the same data structures that protocol other documents define. Could be a CBOR wrapper around a list of receipts, for example. So a list of receipts in CBOR is not a CBOR receipt. And so the API data structures that are returned are not necessarily always going to line up perfectly with a COSI sign 1 or a SCITT receipt. But if we say that the API is HTTP and the API will only expose CBOR resources for the mandatory to implement endpoints, I think that makes it a lot easier to think about what this API is supposed to be doing. And it also is going to potentially really drive a lot of interoperability around consuming resources that are URLs to this API. So if you know that a content type is always mandatory CBOR by default, you can build QR code systems around that are going to process that really well. Any kind of link sharing, is going to be a higher degree of interoperability. So I think it's, my argument would be mandatory support for CBOR on all of the endpoints, optional support for YAML in a debug capacity, and no support for JSON whatsoever. That's it.
Thanks, Ori. And you may have seen that I closed the queue because I would like us to think about those ideas, and then John and I may actually sort of send a mail to the list to have a little bit of a discussion on this, to make a decision, to see where the group is on this topic, on what formats are preferred, or whether the proposal that Ori just said is a good one, or whether people have some other ideas. But I think it's something that we need to think about a little bit more. And we have a few other agenda items, and I would definitely like to get a progress report on the emulator, because we talked about this during the IETF meeting at the hackathon. We also talked about that topic the week afterwards when we had our sort of like wrap-up discussion. And then we need to talk about agenda topics for the next week's call. John, can you give us an update on the emulator?
Yeah, it's probably a good cap to the last conversation and lead into the agenda items for next week. So I have committed everything that implements the hackathon stuff from the last hackathon now, which is working nicely. We have highlighted, you mostly, Hannes, noticed that the terminology in the emulator didn't keep up with the big sweep and update of terminology in the spec itself that we made shortly before 1.17. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get that fixed maybe before the next meeting, certainly within 2 weeks, so that we use the correct verbs in the correct places. For people who were watching the spec changes before 1.17, the big sweep, I think that Yogesh made mostly to correct things like transparent and signed and stuff consistently, that wasn't updated in the code. So we'll get that updated in the code very shortly. So it's in reasonably good shape, I would say, as far as 1.17 goes, but needs updating. And when that's ready for a bit of maybe a show and tell, the archivist implementation of that actually does wrap all the CBOR structures in armored JSON for transmission across the services interface. So we can have a look at the subtleties of what that means. So I'm certainly not advocating for JSON in the receipt or having multiple serialization formats, as Neil raised. That would be a disaster. But for expressing how we transmit those CBOR structures between entities, I think it's very useful, and we've got an implementation of that, so we can just look at it and discuss if there's anything else any further to go there.
Thanks, John. On this issue on the emulator code, apparently you have write permission, so if someone contributes code, you could basically merge it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Steve, Ori, think Henk maybe. We all definitely have kind of reviewer and write permissions to that, and happy to open it as well. It's just it's a hangover from earlier organization that it's a relatively small group.
Okay, so that's excellent. Because I think it's definitely a useful activity to have that reference implementation, so that anyone, sort of particularly those working in the group, could showcase something to their friends and peers and whoever, have a kind of running code type of example. Of course, this is sort of like a playground, rather than a full-fledged production quality implementation, but I think it serves the purpose well. So thanks for doing the work. So that was faster than I thought. Ray, do you want to briefly mention, or you want to withdraw your agenda item?
Well, I was thinking, okay, well, if there's any time, I guess I can just mention it. Here's the deal. So what's happened is the SCITT machine has kind of been pushed down to a lower level where we have minimal descriptions. So like if along the lines of what Dick provided in the vendor submission file, I'm changing it from vendor response file, where we have a description of the vendor, we have a description of the data, and a link back into SCITT to the data, which is kind of a little bit of a wrinkle I didn't expect. But essentially, everything is in the block. And I had previously done a little bit of research when I first started with this group on data packaging trends. And a lot of the trends are now, I guess, kind of represented as not quite the same trend that I wanted, but the open container initiative, which has a little bit more than I wanted in the packaging. But essentially, you know, a lot of that information is in there. So if we take a look at what Dick had, where there was sort of a header of the vendor information and so forth, maybe even the public key of the vendor, maybe even a lot of things in there that would be possible to put at this high level, including references to data artifacts, maybe many of them, but somewhere else. And so there's this chunk of data, and that thing is then.
Right. Sorry if I interrupt you,
Yeah,
but are you, so like Dick proposed that structure
yeah,
a few months back, and are you suggesting to create a different structure, or you are working on a structure that you plan to submit to the group, or
yeah,
where
I do.
you do?
And I just,
okay, that's excellent. Or do you
I'm circling around this right now. I'm still haven't gotten to the point where I wanted to dive in and make a proposal, but I just came to the idea actually last night that maybe it is a good idea to put it all into one document like Dick proposed, including all of the identity information and everything else, and then have maybe one thumbprint or something that would go into this certificate of the because it seems like we would need to either have a standard structure like this where you could find out more information so that you could search or deal with the information that SCITT is, you know, organizing, or have something in SCITT like the way SCITT is right now. It's very minimalistic in terms that it's just like a hash value, signed hash value of something, and that goes into a Merkle tree. And so climbing up above that, my current thinking was to branch off of what Dick had done in a very, very heavy way in terms of adopting kind of like what he was saying, and And yes, including a lot of that stuff in every single one. So maybe there's a lot of redundancy where you say, well, we're just going to identify the person in full in each one of these. Not suitable for every application, but certainly suitable for things such as source code and stuff where size is not an issue. If you're talking about the data item being a SBOM. So I'll tell you what, I don't have anything like prepared yet, but that was kind of the direction I was thinking of going. On the other subject, I don't know why I did post in the thing a link to the
about the other, which other subject?
Yeah, on the other subject, I posted a link to the one we were just discussing, and I brought up the this JSON, CBOR, COSI, zlib, base 45 conversion chain that they use for the EU QR code for COVID, and also a link to that which describes, actually why they made their decisions and had to actually come up with this base 45 encoding, I guess, to do it. And QR codes are usually used for URLs, but they don't have to be. They can be any kind of binary data, and it's better to make them non-binary so that you can actually shine a cell phone on it and read it and see what it is, sort of. But they don't have any restriction. And so what they did there was they just had this change. So I thought I'd bring.
Ray, I need to cut you short because otherwise, but are you working with Dick on that document? Because ideally we would like to have something in front of us to look at and then to have a discussion, right?
Yeah, no, I will, and I'll write something up. I just didn't have time to do it, and that's why I pulled it off the agenda. Thank you.
Okay. Dick, you have 3 minutes, then we need to talk about the agenda.
Okay, thank you, Hannes, and thanks, Ray, for taking a look at that. I'm all in favor of anything we can do to improve, what I call the VRF. One thing I do want to point out, though, there was some reasoning behind the particular structure of that VRF. I work pretty extensively in the software supply chain, and so one thing we see a lot is this concept of systems integrators, and they are vendors who provide multiple software packages. And so that VRF was really designed to, in many ways, to accommodate that reality that we face. And so the things that you will see in there, like all the vendor data at the top, basically represents what could be a systems integrator, and then all the products that they would provide within a contract. So that's some of the reasoning behind the structure that you see, just so you are aware of what's happening there. Thank you, guys.
Dick, I'm going to contact you probably in this week so we can have a powwow about that. Thanks.
That would be excellent.
Happy to do that, Ray. And I've got some other ideas I'd like to see added to it as well. So.
Cool. Okay. As usual, it takes us a little bit longer to discuss items, understandably, because there are so many different viewpoints. So we didn't manage to get through all the open issues, or to get through any open issues, but at least the ones in GitHub. So agenda-wise, what should we put on the plate for next Monday? I think some discussion on the feed structure would be appropriate. I also added some new issues to the GitHub issue tracker in the hope that we could maybe during the week resolve them. I can only create BRs if I understand what the direction of the group is, because it always takes a lot of time to write the text, and if I'm on the wrong track, then it's worse for nothing. So what about doing the feed structure next week, followed by the looking at the GitHub BR/open issues? How is that? Or do you guys have some, want to talk about the API a little bit more, or other topics?
Feed structure will be good. It's kind of been sitting there for a bit. We have an issue tracking it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Sorry, Dick, I'm skipping your queue. Yeah, I think that one dedicated session that does a screen share, and we can go through closing, updating, or actually handling issues and PRs. I think the current PR is not a problem. Is a great idea. Because I think we are always kind of skipping that, and therefore we have to consciously, deliberately reserve some time for that.
Thank you, Hank. Note that. Any other views, Dick?
Yeah, Hannes, very quickly, just I'd like to see if we could focus on the API just to be able to wrap up what comes back after putting a payload into a registry. And that URL, hopefully it's a URL, and that can be distributed for others to pull that data out of the registry. So I'm hoping to focus on the API a little bit more. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. That's perfect. Yeah. We didn't got too far today on the API topic, but yeah, that sounds excellent. So we have already like kind of 3 items already. I think that's good enough for next week. And I would send a pointer to the GitHub issue track again with some of the new issues that I added. Maybe someone of you has some views about this. And I would also like to remind you that you promised to do some work at the last IETF meeting or around it before the submission. So please look at that and help us make progress so that we also during the summer vacation period actually advance the documents accordingly. Hi, Roy. Do you want
John
to
has
say
his hand up first.
Yeah.
Thanks, Roy. Yeah, mine's super quick. Thank you, Hank, for pointing out the meeting issue. I found the bug, and from this point forward, it will be a recurring weekly. So I'll stick that new agenda in, and we'll start it from there.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Right.
I want to raise my concerns here. We're still skirting the charter very closely here. The API we're talking about for the ledger and for transparency statements is a submission or an audit capability. If you want query and storage, we're going to have to reopen the charter. Right? There is no ad hoc query capability against the ledger as it sits today.
Yeah, that's true. But we wanted to extend the API to use the feed. At least that was my recollection, to dip into the.
I understand the feed. John and I have talked about this before, but talking about the specifics of software supply chain and the document formats and so forth, which are being controlled by CISA and NIST and a bunch of others, is getting into a couple of gray areas where we're not chartered for. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Okay. Thank you. Yogesh.
Hi, I just I won't take too long. So I sent a link in the SCITT working mailing list where like few government organizations in US, CISA and Department National Cyber Director of Technology and other organizations are asking how to secure open source software. They're asking for a feedback. So maybe it's good time. We have a good amount of time to prepare something and suggest something and kind of advertise SCITT in a way that suits us as well and them as well. So just one thing I wanted to mention that here.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have much. Hannes, back to you.
Thanks, Yogesh. Okay, cool. I think we are done for today, and so you will see a few emails. John will send around the meeting invite for next Monday, and for the weeks afterwards, and I will
The record
send.
will stay there in the IETF location itself, right? This for this today's meeting as well.
Say that again.
The recordings, the meeting recording are naturally posted there as well, right? Where the agenda is next to the agenda. This today's
Yeah.
meeting.
Yeah, it's the same old story. Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. I would say I think we are done for today. Thank you all.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah, fab. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Anders. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
And everybody, of course.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye, Ray.